Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to Tbilisi to participate in the training and events around your CSR DG 2024 awards. It has been a real privilege to be involved. Corporate culture is required to respond to an increasing number of imposed policies, rules, regulations, benchmarks, and goals on transport, resources, waste, pollution, toxicity, health and well-being, and community. Their aim is to reverse unsustainable trends. And these top-down requirements can be challenging, but our responses define our corporate responsibility and aim to deliver benefits to our social, business, local and global environment. It is clear from the awards that you are all engaged in addressing these serious issues seriously. I want to touch on responsibility. In Roman times, the architect and the engineer had to stand underneath an arch when supports were removed. That, I would suggest, was responsibility. Our responsibilities are not so immediate or personal. The impacts of our decision making are likely to fall on others, the most vulnerable and the young. This afternoon, what I want to do is focus on how we might respond if all the top-down demands and even the dopamine of awards was removed, and instead we look to ourselves for our motivation in addressing these serious concerns. The workshop will look for insight from pioneers who identified fundamental environmental problems and consider how their insights and their core values can impact directly to underpin our corporate strategies in modern business, innovation and the transformation that we require. My aim is to simplify, to help to define relevant responses, individual and collective. We know that unsustainable business wastes resources, causes pollution, causes ill health, promotes inequality and harms biodiversity. Essentially, it makes tomorrow worse than today. And what we're looking for is sustainable business, which will use resources effectively, minimise pollution, create healthy environments, enhance biodiversity, and support communities. And we understand this as responsible stewardship. It's also clear that change does not involve doing slightly better things we shouldn't be doing at all. Sustainable business is advanced class. We are not only responding to time and cost constraints, but also to environmental, social and economic issues. And the process of delivering is not business as usual. We need changes that have the potential to be transformative and regenerative, to repair what has been done by our elders. It requires us to challenge assumptions and processes that people have become comfortable with. Before I progress, let me properly introduce myself. My company, Gaia Group, starts from a basis of research that we want to do, that needs doing, and sometimes even people will pay us to do. We seek to implement this research and then evaluate, feedback, and disseminate our findings. I work largely on built environment issues, and this ranges from material selection to urban design. It embraces solar cooling, passive ventilation, animal architecture, moisture management, lighting, and the circular economy. It means that I work increasingly in capacity building to assist progression of sustainable product and building design. For today, let's start the journey with consideration of one contemporary concern, our climate. Current predictions of climate change are something like this. They are remarkably similar to those that I read in this school textbook. 2.8 by 2020. But I read this in 1971 when I looked like this, and CO2 concentrations were 326 parts per million. As an aspiring physicist, the risks of burning fossil fuels made complete sense. I didn't go on climate strike, though it might have been more impactful if I had. Instead, I trained as an engineer and attempted to solve it. I studied engineering design and appropriate technology, renewable energy, basic needs of food, shelter, water, comfort, and I quickly discovered that designing like you give a damn is a very marginal subject. Meanwhile, by 1980, we had seen the coining of the term sustainable development, and it very rapidly, in my opinion, became somewhat overused. A little like 10-year-olds talk about sex, which is a lot, but not with any great knowledge or insight and not with any inclination to ask anybody who might know more about it. It was my inclination to concentrate more on what we mean by development, and I concluded that there were three options: sustainable development, unsustainable development, or no development at all. When I graduated, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere had risen to 354 parts per million. Fast forward, and the risks have largely been denied with serious consequences. We see the hottest years have been in the last decade, and that this directly correlates with CO2 concentrations, now at 101 parts per million higher than when I read that book. We increasingly see that urban heat islands really do kill. Droughts and fires kill. Flooding kills, quite indiscriminately. And pollution kills. The EU estimates nearly 500,000 early urban deaths due to diesel cars. Homelessness kills, and the wealth gap has never been greater, and will get greater still. Toxicity is associated with extinction of species that are nice, or we actually depend on. And yet we carry on with more and more increasing demands on an increasingly fragile planet, without, it seems, any great pause for thought. The biggest recent change in environmental awareness across the globe that I have perceived is that we do not simply shape our environment. Our relationship is symbiotic. It shapes us. If we kill the thing that supports us, we will die. As a consequence, I find it increasingly difficult to argue with that wonderful Scottish landscape architect, Ian McHarg, who concluded that man is a blind, witless, anthropocentric clod who inflicts lesions upon the earth. This is my good idea number one. And for a moment, I'd like you to consider your motivation. If these awards and these policies and these pressures were removed, when did you first think seriously about caring for our environment? What was your inspiration, and what followed from that? What becomes very clear is that our motivation is unique to ourselves, and as such, we all have something unique to contribute beyond these top-down approaches. Let's go to Rome. The Club of Rome in 1968, a gathering of 30 influential people who met to discuss contemporary concerns. The issues included resource depletion, pollution, waste, disaffection, urban sprawl, wealth inequality, loss of soil fertility, and biodiversity. The common theme was problems relevant to all nations, but too enormous for individual nations to deal with. They required a global response. I think we can all recognise these issues as highly relevant today. The Global Assembly occurred at an interesting and optimistic time. It was the end of the Green Revolution. The world had experienced a period of unparalleled growth in agricultural output. Global food production had expanded by a massive 30% in 10 years, and the assumption was that our technologies would just enable the world to continue to expand to fulfil our needs. It's a big assumption, and the Club of Rome considered that it was probably wrong, because they identified unintended consequences, a 300% increase in the use of pesticides and a huge surge in use and cost of nitrates and mechanical equipment. Their first report, The Limits to Growth, speculated that this was unsustainable. They also contrasted the kind of growth with the way systems actually behave in nature. they tend to oscillate. A population can expand when food is abundant, but the increased population puts pressure on the environment and was most likely then to contract. The food supply can then recover. In a bad winter, mice live under the snow and owls go hungry, and their population falls. In the following summer, the abundant mouse population will provide for an expanding owl population. They identified the risk of exploiting a resource such that it could not recover, and they call this overshoot. A system becomes permanently distorted and cannot go back to where it was before. Failure is inevitable and the system is broken. They predicted that if trends continued, the world's ability to support growth would be reached within 100 years, followed by a sudden decline. This gives rise to my good idea number 2, that infinite growth of material consumption on a finite planet is an impossibility. There was an ongoing debate about techno-optimism versus pessimism. If, for example, we assumed that the state of the world was actually quite good and we followed an optimistic route, the prospects were high. But if we followed the same route and the state of the world was poor, then the outcomes were potentially disastrous. The Club of Rome proposed risk avoidance as the only sensible option. They called for stewardship to seek to stay within the limits of the Earth's ability to cope with the pressures, and this became known as the precautionary principle, one of 5 principles that I would like you to take to heart. The precautionary principle: intergenerational equity, fairness and justice for current and future members of a community; intra-generational equity, which is fairness and justice for all people within a community; conservation of biodiversity; and internalised environmental costs, as in polluter pays. It is still enormously valid as underpinning our responsibilities. My good idea number 2 has not fared well in the intervening time. There has just continued to be exponential growth in extraction and extinction. And in 1992, the Club of Rome declared that we were indeed beyond the limits, 80 years before they had initially predicted we would be. So, are you a techno-optimist who thinks and behaves like technical optimists, or not? Do you believe that we should take a more cautionary route? At the first conference on the environment, the first global conference in Stockholm, there was intense discussion about the risks of replication of Western development patterns. If, for example, China started burning lots of coal, it was a long time ago. Attendees from the poorer countries were initially unimpressed, angry, and dismissive of the moralising attempts by Western nations that had grown rich on exploitation of the Earth's resources, calling for restraint on their development. However, common sense, at least in principle, prevailed. There was ultimately universal agreement that in the common interest, these threats should be taken seriously. It resulted in publication of my good idea number 3, there's only one Earth. This, I'm afraid, has also not thrived. 140 countries use more than one planet. Overall, we now use 3 planets, and of course, many countries use many more. In design terms for survival and climate justice, we must commit to one planet living, the 2000 watt society, or 48 kilowatt hours per day per person for everything. Travel, heating, food, everything. We must use low impact materials and transport and satisfy more of our needs locally. There are excellent models of low impact living, including cities of small distances. My next good idea is a consequence of the Limits to Growth report, which made clear that the number of cars isn't the limiting factor in a system, because one car isn't the same as another car. The number of products isn't the limiting factor in a system either. And indeed, the number of babies isn't the limiting factor. The limit is the primary resource that each of these requires and the waste that they produce. An Indian baby isn't the same as an American baby. One American baby isn't the same as another American baby. And the way to resolve some of these issues is to consider what primary resources we need, but also to consider how we deal with the waste that we produce. To me, this is a designer's dream because there are limits to growth, but there are no limits to development. It provides us with real hope that we have the potential to deliver benign, long-lasting solutions. There is also good evidence that things are moving in the right direction, that whilst poor people obviously become happier by increasing wealth, wealthier people don't seem to get much happier beyond a certain limit. And also that we can get growth using less resources. The two are not interdependent. My next big idea has evolved from the idea that if I was a superhero, I would intervene every time someone talked about energy generation, because everyone wants to talk about megawatts. I'm enough of an engineer to become excited and find fun the idea of a hamster charging a mobile phone and the use of bioluminescence for a cycle track. These are the innovations which we require. But there are so many interventions that are expensive and pointless. I am very tired of turbines that do not and will not turn, and solar panels in the wrong place, and buildings that create a heating load in winter and a cooling load in summer just by being poorly built. And what I find is that no one wants to talk about negawatts. All the low-hanging fruits, the easy wins that actually mean that we can use this energy resource more effectively, and we don't need to produce energy more expensively. A light switch on the stairs, controls on heating circuits, room layouts and positioning, overhangs when the sun is too high and hot, design for light and air. Too much of our tech has an infinite resources mentality. Mechanical systems should be supplements to natural systems like light and air rather than as replacements. So, my good idea number 5 is negawatts, not megawatts. It recognises that energy conservation is the cheapest form of energy. Here, an American study shows that energy efficiency is up to $50 per megawatt hour in cost, which is much, much less than any of the gas combined cycle or coal or nuclear options, and indeed much cheaper than many of the renewable options too. So the design challenge is not to generate more, but to work with what we have and use resources more effectively. To refuse, reduce, recycle, reuse, care and maintain. To design for one planet living, to innovate and to conserve more and then use less. In the late 1940s, Barry Commoner, a scientist and ecologist who is recognised as a founder of modern ecology, expressed disquiet about air and water pollution, fertilisers and detergents that were changing our relationship with our environment. He wrote a marvellous book called The Closing Circle, which I commend to you as a brilliantly written and concise and readable summary of many of these issues. He was a provocative thinker, and in 1980 he stood for President of the United States on 4 unbending laws of ecology, one of which is my good idea number 4, everything must go somewhere. He led a national debate in America over the public's right to be informed about environmental risks and make decisions about them. He found a political voice in the 1950s as a leader of the campaign against nuclear bomb tests. The Nuclear Authority made me an environmentalist, he said. From 1946 to 1951, the US tested 16 nuclear bombs in secrecy and on the assumption that the harmful effects would simply dissipate. Following heavy rainfall in New York in 1953, many scientists noticed an increase in background radiation and began testing soil, air, rain, and food. They found radiation above normal background levels everywhere they looked. The government underplayed the risks, and this infuriated Commoner because they were either lying, denying, ignorant, or ignoring the facts of how strontium-90 travels with calcium. He led a campaign that examined concentration of radiation in milk. He then documented concentrations of strontium-90 in the donated baby teeth of thousands of children, and very quickly set in train events that brought problems of nuclear fallout to a generation. This contributed directly to the adoption of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. He led other campaigns to identify the causes of smog, hydrocarbons from the car industry, the pollution of rivers by fertiliser leaching, and he insisted that the planet's future depended on industry learning not to make a mess, rather than on trying to clear it up. And then, in 1960, he warned that humanity's relationship with the Earth system was in crisis. He compiled statistics showing dramatic increases in production after 1945, and he compiled statistics on production that declined in the same period. By including both increases and decreases, Commoner was making a very important point. If this was simply a growth issue, perhaps driven by population increase, then all products should have increased. In fact, production and pollution had not only increased much more rapidly than population since 1945, but the kind of goods produced had changed rapidly. New production technologies had replaced old ones. So, soap powder had been displaced by synthetic detergents, natural fibres, cotton and wool, by synthetic ones. Steel and timber had been displaced by aluminium, plastic and concrete. Railroad freight had been displaced by trucks, and returnable bottles by non-returnable ones. Fertiliser had displaced land, and traditional methods of insect and weed control had been displaced by chemicals. The environmental crisis wasn't just bigger, said Commoner, it was different. The industrial machine had become a linear economic system. We take virgin and clean resources and create pollution and waste. It involves largely single throughputs of air, water, materials and heat. Most products are made from materials that will be waste in perpetuity. They didn't, as he said, go to Earth. The economic system is profoundly wasteful and involves transferring all of the economic liability to clean it up to future generations. This is not responsible stewardship. He then went on to explain that before World War II there were advances in physics and chemistry. During World War II, science was adopted by the military, and then afterwards by industrial and agricultural motives. There was privatisation of research and considerations of profits, not consequences. And then, of course, cheap oil led to expansion in energy production and transportation, high-energy manufacturing, and replacement of natural products by synthetic ones. And these products and wastes were ones that nature could not cope with, nature could not recycle. The consequences, he said, were greenhouse gases, synthetic fertilisers, toxic waste, deforestation, non-biodegradable materials, species loss, and stress and anxiety. Because production based on the new technology had been much more profitable than production based on the old technology. It was not yet 1970. Commoner probably predicted the oceanic soup of plastic waste, but probably not the ingenuity to stimulate and therefore kill that we have encouraged, or the wholesale mockery of concerns around toxic waste, smog, and hazards. He was likely to be the first person to promote the idea of a circular economy, an economic system aimed at eliminating waste. The implication in business design terms is very profound. It means using less, and a culture of care. Care for material things is ecological. It means refusing, reusing, repairing, recycling, and refurbishment, using materials that are non-polluting and can go to earth, like straw and earth. It means extending the life of our goods and eliminating waste by treating waste from one process as an input to another. And I want briefly to touch on the Kamikatsu Brewery. This is a small village in Japan of 2,000 people, where until quite recently they used to take all of their waste into the street and they burnt it. And then they decided to stop doing that. Now, I don't actually know why that happened, but I think we might presume it was because the nature of the waste had changed, and that burning it was no longer a pleasant or acceptable thing to do. Instead, they became a recycling community, recycling everything. And this microbrewery on a hillside is an outcome of that process. The whole building is made from recycled materials, including the windows from a refurbishment of some local housing that have been used as a full facade, and very attractive it is too. There are opportunities for whole new products from biomaterials, even using mushrooms as a form of building material. And whole townscapes are now being designed on this circularity principle, like Hammarby in Sweden and this eco-city in Tainan. What the circularity reinforces is the importance of eliminating pollution harmful to health and biodiversity. All these pollutants become stuck in the cycle forever. So, if we're going to minimise pollution, we have to design for things to return to Earth at the end of a useful life. And to take the idea of the circular economy seriously. I want to briefly return to this image of Roman times and to ask a question. What if we might assume that what we are doing in design terms is only 30% of what we actually need to do? That when we remove those supports, that arch is going to fall, not on us, but on future generations. And what we might do in order to up our game, to do more, to at least pass the finishing line. And at that point, I think it's worthwhile introducing problems of greenwash, the false claims and exaggerations, the fiddling of tests, and all the other corporate trickery that increasingly blights our profoundly worrying situation. These corporate tricks and these false claims and this greenwash might fool people, but they don't fool nature. The bees will still die, the bills will still have to be paid, and the moon landing won't happen. And I give credit for this good idea, number 7, to Richard Feynman, American theoretical physicist and drummer, who said, for successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, because nature cannot be fooled. Or in simpler terms, you cannot lie to God. I want to move to the subject of creating healthy environments. Rachel Carson is a significant influence on my learning. She was a marine biologist and author of numerous books about the natural world, including Silent Spring. Carson engaged industry in addressing the food chain. She is the source of my good idea number 8. Man is at war with nature, and this war is inevitably a war against ourselves. Importantly, Carson did not have a cuddly back to nature agenda. She wasn't staring down her microscope at pandas and elephants or mammals or birds or butterflies, but at the very underpinning of how organic systems worked. She drew attention to the harmful impact of DDT and its concentration through the food chain. Ultimately, due to Carson, DDT was banned after it was identified in breast milk. She started a real discussion about human environmental impacts. I think you can see from this diagram that we did not respond to this warning. There is a pattern emerging here, is there not? In the intervening 60 years, our use of toxic chemicals has increased dramatically. We use chemicals in products and manufactured goods that are designed to kill species. Much of our treated timber is designed to kill insects that are at the lower end of the food chain. Volatile organic compounds from paints go into the lungs of building occupants, causing particular damage to the young and the vulnerable. Our kitchens and houses are full of phthalates and phenols, and if you really want a reality check, I'm afraid, see this film, because so are your bodies. The fact is, it need not be so. There are always other options of goods and products that do not engage in this war with nature. It does require care, it does require maintenance, it does require attention, but it avoids the necessity to pollute. Even whole communities, as well as buildings, have been designed on this basis of eliminating pollutions. So, can we eliminate toxins from our processes? My next good idea is Patrick Geddes, By Leaves We Live. We can and do create deserts in our environment. These are two options for schools, and I know the one that I prefer. We can plant well and plant for biodiversity. We always have options. It's also our responsibility to enhance biodiversity, so please, let's just do it. My next good idea is Sherry Arnstein, and she was a student of physical education at the University of California. After graduation, she worked as a caseworker in a juvenile court, and then at age 25, she obtained a master's in communication and became a special assistant in the US Department of Health, Education and Welfare. She developed some astonishing insights that led to several papers between 1969 and 1975 dealing with public participation in decision making. She called it the ladder of citizen participation, or Arnstein's ladder. It has 8 rungs, each higher rung representing a greater degree of citizen power. She labelled the 2 lowest rungs on the ladder non-participation. Their aim is to cure or educate the participants. The proposed plan is best, and the job of participation is simply to achieve public support by public relations. Level 3 is informing, an important first step to legitimate participation, but the emphasis is still on a one-way flow of information. There is no channel for feedback. Rung 5 is placation, and this is where a few hand-picked worthies are co-opted onto committees and leaving the power holders with the right to judge and to ignore the legitimacy of their advice. By rung 7, citizens hold a clear majority of seats on committees with delegated power to make decisions. At level 8, a have-nots handle the entire job of planning, policy making and managing a programme. There is a neighbourhood corporation with no blockage between it and the source of funds. Participation without redistribution of power is an empty and frustrating process for the powerless, said Arnstein. It allows the power holders to claim all the sides were considered, but makes it possible for only some of those sides to benefit. We know that when we involve people of all ages in their needs, they will look to solving their real needs and then care for the outcomes. Their real needs will be peace, a clean landscape, food, good housing, education and decent transport. These are the real needs. This is an example of a community centre conceived, designed and built by a local community and maintained and managed by them. Many of the deep transformations that we need to achieve sustainability require long-term processes. Engaging stakeholders and the public in these processes is vital. Gaia sought to emulate this process when we were asked to investigate the development of an industrial area in central Scotland. It rapidly became clear that the major barrier to development was the proximity to this, one of the most derelict criminalised housing estates in Scotland. The first steps were then nothing to do with buildings, but they were about rebuilding trust and self-belief in the community, restoring a sense of real pride in their place. The overriding objective was to achieve a self-directed community and buildings that combined a healthy indoor climate and energy conservation. As part of the problem-solving initiative, Gaia set up and trained a cooperative client group on the estate and then applied to them for work. The project continually evolved and innovated. The project then won international acclaim, an exceptional example of urban and social and ecological renewal based on a long, patient process of user participation. It is now a thriving model community. This, I would suggest, is an example of what I also called subsidiarity. Citizen participation is the redistribution of power that enables those citizens presently excluded from the political and economic processes to be deliberately included. All decisions should always be taken at the closest point to where they will have their effect. I think it's also important to mention the inspirational EcoCity project, in which 10-year-olds from 4 Edinburgh schools put together a vision for their area. Over 1 week, the children developed a model of the site that reflected their concerns about pollution, energy and water conservation, waste, infrastructure and biodiversity. They integrated environmental, community and economic aspects through job creation, recreation, support services and mixed-use development. The children chose to regenerate their existing housing, transforming it into a collection of village units connected by trams, cycle and skate paths and walkways. The landscape strategy provided for a wildlife corridor and local food production. New housing took advantage of solar energy, polluting materials were banned, recycling centres were located at tram stations. The children paid close attention to the need to provide emergency services and access to buildings, but otherwise cars were seen as undesirable. It has to be said that they hit every policy target any municipality could want in a way that many builders corrode those targets. Most of it, of course, was ignored. The children, who will now be 35 to 40 years old, should, of course, have been given the budget. My good idea number 11 is the incoming king of Bhutan, who declared that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. He was only 17. And again, a reminder of what people really want. My short history of good ideas is actually, of course, a long history of missed opportunities. I've recounted 60 years of A-class thinking with A-class facts being ignored, and, apart from a few rare examples, it is the bad and least resilient ideas that become replicated. Our business leaders have largely ignored the warnings, and the arch is falling on us and ours. It is unclear if our system is broken or what, if anything, we can do to rescue. But it is not too late to choose the intelligent path. Thankfully, we still have the option to rescue ourselves. The change must come from us. We must aim for the very best practice rather than shirk our professional obligations. Time and opportunity are our most precious resource, and to waste them would be tragic. It has taken such a long time for sustainable development to be seen not as a restraint on development, but as a restraint on inappropriate development. And the best example of responsible business are simultaneously more efficient, much more socially accountable, and much less damaging to the environment than before. And all of our businesses should be thriving and striving to be in that space. We owe it to future generations, because to fail now is to fail forever. Thank you. The work starts now.